The killing of Alex Pretti has forced the nation to confront a long-standing contradiction at the heart of American governance: the balance between federal authority and individual civil liberties. On one side stands the vast machinery of the state, equipped with legal power, armed personnel, and broad operational mandates. On the other stands the citizen, protected by constitutional rights that are supposed to serve as a shield against overreach. When these two forces collide, the result is not merely a tragic loss of life, but a political and moral crisis that demands public scrutiny and institutional reform. This incident did not occur in a vacuum. It unfolded within a larger national atmosphere marked by heightened enforcement, political polarization, and widespread distrust in government institutions. At the center of this debate is the question of how far federal agencies should be allowed to go in the name of security. Supporters of aggressive enforcement argue that federal officers must be granted wide discretion to respond quickly to perceived threats. They claim that hesitation can lead to greater danger for both officers and the public. Yet critics counter that such discretion, when left unchecked, often results in excessive use of force and the erosion of civil protections. The killing of a legally armed citizen, particularly one with no confirmed history of violent wrongdoing, raises fundamental concerns about whether enforcement protocols prioritize de escalation or default to confrontation. Civil liberties exist precisely to prevent the concentration of unchecked power. The right to bear arms, the right to due process, and the right to protection from unreasonable force are not symbolic ideals. They are practical safeguards designed to limit the authority of the state. When a federal operation ends in lethal force, it signals a potential failure of these safeguards. The public response to the Pretti case illustrates this reality. Communities have questioned not only the actions of the officers involved, but also the broader policies that govern federal engagement with civilians. These questions reflect a deeper fear that constitutional rights can be selectively applied depending on political climate, location, or administrative priorities. Ultimately, the tension between federal power and civil liberties is not a technical policy debate, but a question about the nature of democracy itself. A society that values freedom must constantly renegotiate the limits of authority, ensuring that security measures do not undermine the rights they claim to protect. The Pretti case has reopened this debate on a national scale, forcing lawmakers, institutions, and citizens to re examine whether current enforcement practices reflect democratic values or drift toward centralized control backed by force. President Trump's shifting response to the killing of Alex Pretti illustrates how modern political leadership is increasingly shaped by crisis management, media pressure, and public backlash. In the immediate aftermath, early statements from administration officials framed the incident in a way that sought to justify federal action, emphasizing security concerns and portraying the operation as necessary and defensive. This initial narrative followed a familiar pattern: establish authority, defend enforcement agencies, and minimize uncertainty. However, as new information emerged and public scrutiny intensified, that narrative began to evolve, exposing the tension between political loyalty and factual accountability. As video evidence and witness accounts entered the public conversation, the administration faced a growing credibility challenge. The president's later remarks, which acknowledged the tragedy and called for an honest investigation, signaled a recalibration of tone. This shift was not merely rhetorical, it reflected the political reality that public opinion, especially during moments of national outrage, can quickly reshape the boundaries of acceptable discourse. When leaders change their language from firm defense to cautious sympathy, it reveals how power adapts under pressure rather than standing on consistent principle. The evolution of Trump's response also highlights the influence of internal political divisions. Members of his own party began raising concerns, demanding transparency, and calling for accountability. This bipartisan pushback disrupted the traditional expectation of unified party messaging during controversial events. For the president, this created a strategic dilemma: maintain unwavering support for federal agencies and risk alienating moderate voters and allies, or acknowledge public concerns and risk appearing inconsistent to his core supporters. The resulting statements attempted to navigate both paths at once, expressing regret while still defending broader enforcement policies. Another factor driving the shift was the role of digital media. In an era where information spreads instantly, political leaders no longer control the narrative in the way they once did. Videos, independent reporting, and public commentary circulate faster than official press releases. This environment forces rapid response, often before full investigations are completed. Trump's changing tone reflects this dynamic, where statements must be constantly adjusted to keep pace with evolving public perception. The speed of communication has transformed political reactions from carefully planned strategies into continuous real time damage control. This pattern raises important questions about leadership authenticity. When responses shift according to political winds, citizens begin to question whether leaders are guided by ethical responsibility or electoral calculation. The Pretti case exposes this tension clearly. Was the call for investigation driven by genuine concern for justice or by the recognition that public outrage demanded visible action? Such uncertainty weakens trust in institutions and reinforces cynicism about political motives. At a broader level, Trump's reaction demonstrates how crises reveal the priorities of those in power. When leaders are forced to respond under pressure, their choices expose what they value most: institutional protection, political survival, or public accountability. The way this situation unfolded offers a case study in how political messaging adapts during controversy, showing that in modern governance, perception management often competes with transparent truth telling. The growing demand for transparency and accountability in the aftermath of the Alex Pretti killing reflects a deeper crisis of trust between citizens and the institutions meant to serve them. When federal operations result in the loss of civilian life, the public instinctively looks for clear answers. Who made the decision? What protocols were followed? And why did the situation escalate to lethal force? These questions are not driven by emotion alone. They are rooted in the democratic principle that power must always be subject to oversight. Without transparent processes, official statements risk being perceived as self protective narratives rather than honest explanations. Calls for independent investigations have emerged from multiple political camps, demonstrating that accountability is no longer confined to partisan debate. Lawmakers from different ideological backgrounds have recognized that allowing agencies to investigate themselves creates an inherent conflict of interest. Independent review bodies, congressional oversight committees, and judicial inquiries are essential mechanisms to ensure that facts are established objectively. The pressure for such measures shows that the public is no longer satisfied with internal reports that remain hidden from view or are selectively released to shape public opinion. Transparency also extends beyond investigations into the broader culture of federal enforcement. Citizens increasingly demand access to body camera footage, operational guidelines, and decision making frameworks that govern high risk encounters. When these materials are withheld or heavily redacted, suspicion grows. In contrast, when institutions proactively release information and clearly explain their procedures, they create space for informed public debate. The Pretti case has intensified this demand as many see it as an opportunity to test whether government agencies are truly committed to openness or merely performing symbolic gestures of reform. Accountability, however, is not limited to identifying individual officers or officials. It also involves examining systemic patterns that contribute to repeated incidents of excessive force. Training standards, rules of engagement, and leadership directives all play a role in shaping how enforcement actions unfold. Without addressing these structural factors, disciplinary actions become isolated responses rather than meaningful reforms. This is why civil rights organizations and advocacy groups have emphasized the need for policy level accountability alongside individual responsibility. The role of the public and media in sustaining pressure cannot be ignored. Investigative journalism, independent watchdog groups, and community activism have become central forces in demanding institutional change. By keeping cases like Pretty's in the public eye, they prevent them from fading into bureaucratic silence. This sustained attention forces political leaders to respond, even when doing so may be uncomfortable or politically risky. Ultimately, the demand for transparency and accountability represents a broader struggle over democratic control. A system that operates behind closed doors, shielded from scrutiny, gradually loses legitimacy. When citizens feel excluded from the truth, they withdraw their trust and question the authority of those in power. The Pretti case has become a focal point in this ongoing struggle, symbolizing the urgent need to rebuild confidence through open processes, independent oversight, and a genuine commitment to institutional responsibility. The killing of Alex Pretti has intensified public distrust toward federal institutions and raised serious concerns about democratic stability. When citizens witness a civilian death tied to a government operation, the emotional impact quickly transforms into political anxiety. People begin to question whether the systems designed to protect them are instead becoming sources of fear. This erosion of trust does not remain isolated to one agency or one incident. It spreads across institutions, affecting how communities perceive law enforcement, political leadership, and the broader structure of governance. The result is a fragile social environment where skepticism replaces confidence and suspicion replaces cooperation. Public trust is the foundation upon which democratic systems operate. Without it, policies lose legitimacy, laws feel imposed rather than agreed upon, and civic participation declines. The Pretti case has contributed to a growing sense that official narratives cannot always be taken at face value. Conflicting statements, delayed disclosures, and incomplete information have reinforced the belief that transparency is selective and politically motivated. When citizens feel that truth is filtered through strategic messaging, they become less willing to engage constructively with institutions, opting instead for protest, resistance, or disengagement. This incident has also amplified social polarization. Supporters of strict enforcement policies interpret the event through a lens of security and authority, while critics frame it as evidence of systemic abuse of power. These opposing interpretations deepen ideological divides and reduce the possibility of common ground. Instead of fostering dialogue, controversial incidents often harden positions, pushing communities further apart. In such an atmosphere, even factual discussions become politicized, making it difficult to establish shared understanding or consensus. The unrest and demonstrations that followed the killing highlight another dimension of democratic instability: the tension between public expression and institutional response. Peaceful protests are a core democratic right, yet heavy handed reactions can escalate tensions and reinforce perceptions of authoritarian behavior. When people gather to demand accountability and are met with aggressive enforcement, the message they receive is not one of dialogue, but of control. This dynamic fuels cycles of confrontation that weaken social cohesion and increase the risk of long-term instability. Economic and social pressures further complicate this landscape. Communities already struggling with inequality, limited access to services, and political marginalization are more likely to interpret incidents like this as confirmation that the system is stacked against them. The Pretti case has resonated particularly strongly in such environments where trust in institutions is already fragile. When multiple layers of dissatisfaction overlap, a single event can trigger broader movements of resistance and reform demands. Ultimately, the challenge facing democratic societies is how to restore public confidence while maintaining effective governance. Trust cannot be rebuilt through speeches alone. It requires consistent behavior, transparent processes, and genuine accountability. The Pretti case has become a symbol of this broader struggle, representing the fragile relationship between citizens and the state and the urgent need to strengthen democratic legitimacy through fairness, openness, and institutional reform. Leadership responsibility in moments of crisis is not measured by press conferences or carefully crafted statements, but by the ability to act with integrity, restraint, and clarity under pressure. The killing of Alex Pretti placed political leaders in a position where every word and decision carried significant consequences. In such situations, leaders are faced with a fundamental choice: prioritize political survival or uphold principles of justice and accountability. The public response to this event demonstrates that citizens increasingly expect more than symbolic gestures. They demand leadership that confronts uncomfortable truths and addresses systemic failures rather than deflecting blame or shifting narratives. A responsible leader must first acknowledge the human cost of tragedy. Behind political debates and institutional defenses lies the reality of a lost life and a grieving family. When leaders fail to center this human dimension, their responses appear detached and transactional. Empathy is not a weakness in governance, it is a foundation for restoring trust. By recognizing the emotional and social impact of such incidents, leaders can create space for dialogue and healing rather than deepening division. Another critical aspect of leadership during crisis is transparency. Attempts to control the narrative by withholding information or presenting incomplete accounts often backfire. In the modern media environment, inconsistencies are quickly exposed and credibility is easily lost. Leaders who commit to openness, even when the facts are politically inconvenient, demonstrate respect for democratic norms. Transparency signals that the government is accountable to the people rather than operating above them. This approach may carry short term political risks, but it strengthens institutional legitimacy in the long run.